Hi everyone. If you give me just a second here, the UPS man just stopped by and a package from CG Cookie just came. I have no idea what it is. Ah. Looks like we got a new art book. The Art of Fred Gambino. I'll have to check that out later. That's pretty neat. I'm really into art books that are just focused on a solo artist nowadays, so that was a nice little surprise. All right, anyways, back to the live stream. Thank you everyone for coming to this live stream. We do these every Wednesday at 2 p.m. and that's Central Time in the States, and that's -5 GMT outside of the States. So let me go ahead and do the last push on our marketing fronts all around so that I can make sure everyone that wanted to come here today can be here. Then we will go ahead and start the stream. And normally I'll post what we're going to be doing like an hour before the actual stream, sometimes more than that. And today we're going to be looking at coloring the eyes. The eyes are actually my favorite thing to color on a character, and I like to draw a lot of attention to it. So I'll kind of go through different tips and techniques that I like to do to either add contrast or something that brings your eye to the eyes. So let me go ahead and finish this off, and then we will go ahead and get started. And also, I wanted to do the 5 different types of eyes, which are the round, almond, slanted, sloopy, and hooded eyes. So kind of give you a feel for what are the different types of eyes out there, so you guys can have a better idea of working on eyes in your own time. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to share out my screen right away. And pretty much I'm going to be working directly on that initial little post out that I did here. I'm going to make it as big as I can for you guys. And then, as always, I'm going to leave the question app open. So if you guys have any questions during the stream anytime, go ahead and feel free to ask any questions you may have, and it may not even be related to the subject matter we're working on. So if you just have a question about Photoshop or concept art in general or anything, just go ahead and leave it in the questions. And although I don't have Deandra, I'll be hopefully pretty consistent with going back and forth on looking at the questions and answering them. So now let's go ahead and actually start drawing rather than me blathering this whole live stream here. So the first thing that you may notice is that we're not working on a white background. And that's because I feel white is rather intimidating, and it can be, sometimes it actually hinders you from doing your best work because then you're trying to make everything look perfect from the get-go, where sometimes it's just easier to have a neutral background base like this color here to work on top of. And even if this is a neutral gray, I would recommend working with those as well. And the eyes themselves are on their own layer. And at first, I'm going to be working underneath the line art layer, and then after a little bit, I'm going to be working on top of the line art layer. So the further we get along, you'll kind of see what I mean. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new layer. Let's grab that initial color, and let's start building our values. Because right away, I can see that the line art is here, and it's giving us an idea of what the different shape structures are, but they're very flat. So let's start getting some depth in there. And from doing eyes and just digital art in general, after a while, you kind of know the areas to hit to give something depth, or to give it that look, that illusion of a three-dimensional form. So usually, I am just going and repeating the processes that I do for all my pieces, and I know where to add the different shades and tones to make it look as if it's extracting out. And I think the more that you do it, the more you'll become comfortable as well. So if right now you're still feeling a little uncomfortable and you're uneasy and unsure about where to add your own values, just know it'll come with time and practice. And the more that you really look at real life reference, the better you'll actually be able to see exactly where you want to be laying down those values. So here's a good example of, see how we have the skin fold right here? Where some people have that very heavy underlid, and this is a good example of it. And to really focus and emphasize that there's some weighting to this, I like to have the contrast of the darker shade next to the lighter shade. And what that will do is that'll bump this part up. And it'll become more clear, especially as I hide the line art layer. But the easiest way you can give something form is to bump up contrast between two shades of the same color but in a different value. So for instance, the skin color, I'm just using a lighter value of the same hue, but the way that I'm working it around the eye will pop it kind of away from that darker shade, and it'll give the illusion of depth. Someone's asking, do I know Warhammer? Yes, I know of Warhammer, and there's some crazy good art and artists that have worked on it. But typically, I don't really play games too much anymore. I would say every now and then I'll probably get a round of League of Legends in, or sometimes there's like a nice handheld or a game that really doesn't take too much like involvement, like Mario Kart 8 I was really into for like the past 2 weeks. Like that was a fun like bring it around with your family type game. And I guess before that, Bravely Default really captured my attention. Not so much because it was like this deep, involved story, but just because the art was really cool to look at, and it was just a fun game to kind of pass the time. But often I try not to play video games because I think I always like second guess myself, like, oh, I could be drawing, or I could be doing something more productive. But every now and then, you still need to relax a little bit. You don't need to be high strung all the time. So now that I got my first base on this eye, I'm going to move on to my round eye here. I'm going to be working probably a little faster so that you guys can what I'm doing on all of these eyes rather than just making one eye look really nice. And I'm not going to be focusing so much on like the eyebrows or too much skin outside of the eye, because I really want to focus and just really isolate the eye area and give you all my perspectives on how to go about drawing it. Have I ever done an art hammer or a Warhammer art piece or something related? Maybe. I would say I did do a commission for World of Warcraft Night Elf, but I haven't really done any Warhammer specific things. So I'm going to say no, I have not. Someone's asking, I have trouble drawing male eyes and they always seem to end up looking female-like. Any tips? And this is definitely something that I get a lot, especially, actually more so with lips. I hear people have, or artists in general, just have a hard time drawing lips on a male because they always end up looking very feminine. So the one thing you can definitely do is be very leery with how much black or how much you're emphasizing the eyelashes. Because oftentimes a heavier emphasis on eyelashes usually indicates a female persona. Now, if you're like me and you kind of give your male characters more of a Final Fantasy look, where they're definitely more feminine in general, but they're still male, you can definitely add those eyelashes. Just make sure when you're drawing the eyes themselves, maybe add some subtle hints of age, or things like this eye up here definitely seems more masculine, even if I gave it some heavy eyelashes, where an eyeball like this one, a round eye, typically is more female. Now, this is just very general, where obviously everyone has their own unique pair of eyes, but I would say there are some little things you can do to make them look more masculine or feminine. I think one thing you can definitely do is like this under lid, the heavy underlid, definitely gives more of a masculine vibe to it. Even though there's plenty of females out there that have that under bag, you just want to be, smart in your choices of, okay, if I add this, am I making him look too feminine? Or if I'm doing this, will it make him too masculine? And if you're purposely trying to go masculine, then try to avoid more of the feminine looks of an eye. But the best way that you can go about doing that as well is just practice. Literally pull up pictures of male eyes and draw them, and then pull up pictures of female eyes. And makeup is definitely a huge thing that can add that touch that separates a female and a male eye. Especially if you have like shading or what is that called? Eyeshadow. Anything that gives the eyes more of that feminine look. So I'm moving on to my droopy eyes here. Oh, and you know what? I'm actually going to write what each of these eyes are. And the reason I find this so important because I'm one of those people that are really obsessed with eyes and how they look. And hooded eyes are my favorite to draw and my favorite on a person. That doesn't mean that I don't draw other eyes. It just normally you'll see that you tend to kind of gravitate toward one style. And that goes for eyes, noses, mouths, almost everything. And you'll kind of find that you draw almost a specific style as you do these long enough. And I noticed that like my favorite artists, I can almost tell them apart if you just cropped out the eyes in their picture. Like I can tell who drew it. So here I'm going to kind of showcase what each of these 5 eyes are. And usually almost any eye ever will be a combination or a solo version of this. So some eyes can be round but still have a hooded look to it. So then let's go around. These are almond eyes. Almond are pretty much your basic eyes. Slanted. And these are droopy eyes. Oh, and you can see even as I hide that layer, you can start to see some of that eye develop just purely from the one value that we've been adding. I'm going to go back and continue adding to my droopy and my slanted eyes before I move on. So then the other thing that I'm doing is I'm kind of shading the same areas. So if you noticed, I have like, I want to say 4 areas that I definitely always hit on. One is usually always right above the eyebrow. The other is below the eyebrow, either toward the center or on the side. So in the droopy eye case, we're definitely shading more on the side. The upper eyelid, the lower eyelid, and the area under the lower eyelid. And those are the main ones that I want to focus on and that I will be focusing on in this live stream. Someone's asking, what's your opinion on tracing related to exercise drawing? So that's a good question. I don't think tracing is so much helpful as it is harmful, but in the same regard, if you're doing this from like a Google image, let's say you pull up, oops, after you do that area, that's okay. So let's say that you pulled up an area or a picture of someone's face and you're trying to recreate it for practice or whatever purpose. I think that if you turn the layer on a low opacity and just trace over it, that doesn't actually teach you anything. That doesn't force you to analyze the picture and really look at it and kind of force yourself to learn proportions and anatomy and whatever else. And I think the best thing that you can do if you want to use reference for practice is literally just do a side-by-side. Grab your picture, pull it up right against a blank canvas, and do constant looks back and forth between the picture itself and what you're drawing. And over time, if you do enough of those, you will find that you don't need the picture anymore because it's all ingrained in your memory. And then from there, you'll be able to do your own original works without even the need of a reference or a picture. Not to say that it's still good to have reference. Like even now, I still use reference all the time. And you'll notice that artists that typically are either in the industry or they need to create quick images or they need to do something more efficiently, they'll always use reference. Okay, so now let's go on and do one more value shade on all 5 eyes. So pretty much I'm going to my color picker, I'm choosing a color that's lighter in value and a little less saturated. So this is the color that we get. And I'm going to do these on a new layer. And pretty much I'm working then inside of the value that I just laid out, but I'm not working it quite as heavy. And once I'm done, you'll be able to see better on what this little addition adds. Someone's asking, would you say that you normally shouldn't draw with 100% black or white? That's a tough question because I know there are some artists that do work purely in grayscale and then add color on top. I would say a lot of that comes down to personal preference. And I know it's something that I do actually enjoy doing it, even though I love color. I do it from time to time, but I would say that for me, the process of creating art is so much more enjoyable when I have color to work with, just because I feel like I'm more of a color artist, and that's something that gravitates my enjoyment of actually working on a piece. So I like to work with color, but that's not to say that the next artist, that you meet hates color and hates working in color and likes adding color at the end. And what they find really fun is adding values and seeing the transitions between the different grayscale values and shades, and that might be their thing. So I personally don't shade really or like start in black and white that often, but I definitely know there's a lot of artists that do, and they find it super enjoyable and functional and efficient because then they don't have to worry about colors and hues or balance or harmony or anything until later on when they add color. So it kind of isolates the values and really looks at how accurate their portrayal of values are. Someone's asking, can you do a critique in the live stream if it is something related to the stream? Yes, I want to say yes. I have never done that before. I have gotten requests that if I did an entire stream just purely on people sending in critiques or sending in their pieces for me to critique during a stream. I actually really like that idea. I think sometime in July we're going to do a full one where it's like it gives people a couple weeks to send in their pictures, and then I'll choose like the best 5 that I feel like I can really work on top of and give some good advice or tips, and then work with those during the stream. Okay, now I'm going to move on to my droopy eyes. And if you can't really tell the progress that has been made, this is what that layer has done on and off. So it's subtle, but it'll make a lot of difference when I hide the line art layer. Because every value that you add to your picture is going to add so much more value to the different shades and the transition between the colors. But that's not to say that you need to go overboard. I think I had a problem where I was trying to add too many shades, and then for a long while it looked like it was over rendered, is what I called it. It's overvalued. And I think sometimes you have to also remember that simplicity can be a miracle worker if done right. So don't feel like you always have to overblow it and make everything perfect, draw every pore on the eye. Because sometimes that actually ruins a piece. Sometimes keeping it simple will actually enhance the overall look of your piece. Now for the slanted eye, they don't have that upper eyelid that we normally see on all the other eyes. The hooded one's still there, even though it kind of merges with the eyelash layer, or the upper lid where that ends. But for the most part, this skin layer is going to come up right against the slanted part of the upper eyelid. And I'm going to ignore the eyebrows for the most part. Actually, I think I'm even going to take off the eyebrows. Or I guess that's on that layer, so it doesn't really matter that much. Okay, so that's what this skin layer has done. So let's turn off the line art so you can see the before and after, how it just adds that much more depth to it. Now they still look kind of scary. This almost looks like they could be like horror eyes or something where there's no eyeball or a cornea or pupil, iris, anything, where it's just kind of blank slates. So we're going to go ahead and change that right now. Now I'm going to make another new layer. And for the white of the eye, and I say that with air quotes because they're not actually white. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be choosing a mid-tone gray almost. So let's see, I'm going to actually make that a little lighter. It's not super dark. Something around there. Or maybe even a little darker. But I'm also adding just a tad of hue to it as well. I like to usually pull from the skin colors around the eye, or depending on if they're like an intense lighting scenario, like if the sun is hitting directly in their eye, I'll usually put more warm hues in the eye. But if they're like around a very cool environment, like a lake, let's say lake lighting was bouncing up back into the eye, then I would probably pull more blue hues into the actual eyeball. So what I like to do, rather than just do like flat coloring like this, I mean, it'll definitely separate the skin and the eyeball itself, but I usually like to build up the cornea part, and that's the scientific term for the white part of the eye. Because I don't like calling it the white part of the eye, because the only thing that should be white should be more or less the specular. And usually that will fall somewhere like on the iris or the pupil itself. So since usually I have lighting coming from a downward angle, I usually have the bottom of the eye catching more of that light, where the top might be having just a little bit more of a shadow area because of the lid that's casting a shadow down on the actual cornea. Now, round eyes really showcase a lot of the cornea, and this is why round eyes are seen so often, is because they definitely give that childlike expression. They're very expressive, and I think they are fun to draw, because then you can definitely showcase more of the pupil and the iris. And for this one, I want to make sure that I get just below the eyeball. And it's kind of up to you if you want the iris touching the cornea or if you want there to be like the sliver of the cornea showing underneath. And usually you'll see that with droopy eyes, where you'll definitely see a slim segment of this light gray of the cornea showing. Someone's asking, to add some more details to my question, I mean, when you use white in the eyes, for example, that it shouldn't be white with 1 in value, so instead 0.8 value. Maybe the same for the black in shadows. Absolutely. You'll hear a lot of times, especially when I interview some of these bigger name artists, they always say try to avoid, or not always, most of them usually say avoid using pure white and pure black. Because oftentimes that'll add either too much contrast, or you're working or relying on hiding things, especially with shadows. I see too many artists hide their mistakes in shadows. And admittedly, I've done it before too. And I know sometimes it'll be frustrating, where it's like if you can't get a hand right, you'll be like, you know what, well, the hand's just going to go in the pocket. Or we're going to do something where I eliminate the frustration completely. And oftentimes that's done in shadows. But my best advice with that is just wait a day and look on it a different time. Just put it away for the time being. Work on something else if you're still in the drawing mood, and come back to it at a different time. Because hiding your mistakes or eliminating the frustration oftentimes will hinder you, because then you never actually learned how to do it. You just learned how to cover it up. It's kind of like when a little kid like spills like a drink or something on the floor, and rather than cleaning it up, they put like a carpet or something over it to hide their mistakes. But in this case, we really want to be like, okay, what can we do to make this look accurate and execute it the best to your knowledge and your ability? Now we're going to end it off with the slanted. Someone's saying, hi Tim, you mentioned you started as a 3D artist. Is there a place for basic 3D modeling and concept design? Absolutely. Actually, I wish I did do more 3D even to this day, where I find that a lot of awesome artists will lay out like a base model for them to work on top of, and then it'll be really basic. Like when I mean basic, I mean like almost indistinguishable features. If they're doing like a character, it'll just be like a rough base for them to draw on top of. And oftentimes it's usually done just for lighting purposes, to give it that ambient occlusion lighting. And I actually wish I did that more, but yeah, there's definitely a place for 3D artists in the concept process. And I've worked with many 3D artists before, so I kind of know what they need from a concept artist. And you got to keep it simple. You got to make it something where you definitely can't hide anything. You really got to make it very clear and easy to read for the 3D modeler to understand what your concept is. Someone says, my art instructor always said, think and visualize the shape you want to draw in 3D mesh to find the form and drawing 2D with lines and colors. Simply, you put think 3D and draw 2D. What you say about this advice, and if you have anything to add. That's actually the best way to describe it. Almost anytime I draw a concept art piece, I always imagine it in my 3D space, because since I was trained as a 3D artist, I kind of saw how lighting affects the different shadows and the forms and how lighting really works. And I think once you really grasp and have a solid understanding of lighting, man, it'll just take your concept pieces so much further because then you really do think of it as in a 3D space, and then you're trying to accurately portray anything you draw in that same 3D space. So I actually love that. I might actually pull that quote and I'm going to put that on Facebook because I think that's such a good one. So I'm going to write that down here and then put that on after. So usually I find that the artists that also have a knowledge of 3D or have some 3D background to them oftentimes are the best with lighting and know and can kind of understand the full grasp of a character as a whole. So not just like a pretty drawing from a front view, but they can really understand what it would look like from behind, from the sides. And those are the artists that typically are the best concept artists. Okay, so those are the white part of the eye. So now for here, let's go ahead and draw in the little pink exposed muscle that you usually see at the corner of the eye. And I actually didn't know this for a long time, but it is actually exposed muscle tissue that is in the corner of the eye. I don't remember the scientific term for this one. I usually just call it like the exposed muscle tissue in the corner of the eye. That's a really long way of explaining. I probably should find a better term or quick way to say it. So usually I'll lay out a softer pink in the middle and then lay it heavier around the edges. Okay, now let's work on adding some iris color. Now this is a big thing, I think, for learning and better understanding what is good color choices and poor color choices, especially if you're doing something more realistic. Because if you're doing something that's more cartoon or animation or pixel, sometimes working with bold, bright, saturated colors work well. But if you're working in more realism, something like this type of blue isn't exactly realistic, and it's actually very distracting where it looks very out of place. So I'm gonna let actually that one stay there, and then I'm gonna pull a different color to work with the round eye. So even though people will have blue eyes, that doesn't technically mean that it's just gonna be this bright sapphire blue. And usually people that have really beautiful blue eyes, they're very crystal light, and they have a very little amount of a powerful hue behind it. So this is the second example of a blue eye. But let's take it one step further and let's desaturate it and really take it very close to gray. Something around here. So usually working with my base of an eye, this is a good example of the 3 stages. So let me do a better triangle here. Here we go. So this stuff I usually use for like cartoon, realism, oops, and then stylized will be something in between. So if you're working with more cartoon stuff or animation, or like what I said, you can definitely work with more bold and bright colors. But if you're working more in realism, really mute the color. And if you want some of the saturation or color to pull through, work with adding that lighter color on the bottom half of the iris. So let's go ahead and show you guys what I mean. So I'm going to make another new layer, and I'm going to pull that color that we got here. And you can see if I make it really big here, it's a very desaturated, dark valued blue. And it's a good base for me to work on top of. So then from here, I might pull in a lighter blue and then work like this. And when working with an eye, actually I might even put this on top of the line art layer. Oops. Line art. Okay. So even with this blue that I'm adding here, I'm adding it to the bottom. I'm going to grab a better color here. I'm adding it to the bottom part of the iris because the way that the eye would catch that light, it would go through the front part of the eye, and I wish I had my reference here, but pretty much every eyeball has like a little contact over the actual iris. And that's because the iris itself is convex, I believe. You know what? I'm going to actually look this up really quick before I tell you guys what I think it is. Sometimes I get the wording confused, but I know what I'm trying to say. So I want to make sure I'm saying it accurately here. So I'm just going to the DeviantArt page. Okay. So the iris itself is concave. The little lens on top of the eyeball itself is convex. So lights can be hitting that convex part of the eye and kind of landing inside of the concave part of the iris. And that's why, and this top example is a really good one, of why the bottom half of the iris will usually be reflecting light or catching light, and then the top half is usually more in shadow. So I'm going to go ahead and hide that. And if you want to look at this for longer, it's on our DeviantArt page. It's in our Facebook collection as well. And it's on our actual Concept Cookies site. But for now, I'm going to hide it. But that is my reasoning for adding more of that color on the bottom half of the iris itself. And now for the pupil, this is the one time where I may use a color really, really close to black. I'm still not using a pure black. But the worst thing that I find, or at least for me, maybe it's just a personal style thing, is I don't like just making a pure solid black dot. I like to have it fade into the rest of the piece just a tad. So even a slight transition from the black to the iris, I think works better. Something like that. So even though it's still pretty bold and blunt, it doesn't have a definitive line separating the two. And now all people have a different way of, or each of their eyes will line the iris differently. Well, some eyes you'll see have like a dark lining around the actual iris, where some it'll be very thin. So that you can kind of do personal preference on what you like to do more, what you like to see more. But for me, I'm going to keep it somewhere in between. So you can see what that would look like with the line on and off. So even this, I'm starting to get a little more fantastical, where I'm really trying to upplay the features of the eye, where sometimes a more realistic eye will still be more muted than this, and this is where it will come down to personal preference. But for me, I'm going to do it something more like this. Maybe that outline is a little too dark. Something like that. And then let's start shading the little skin folds around the eye. So now I'm working on top of that line art layer. So if I add any strokes, it'll be right on top of the actual skin layer, or on top of that line art layer. So I'm kind of trying to cover it up. But right now you can tell that our skin layer is looking very flat, and that's because we're only working with 3 different shades. And that's because we're working with the base color that we started off with, and then the 2 shades lighter in the value. So I'm going to go ahead. Let's get some more colors in here. Now I like working with warm colors, typically more with skin more than cool colors. And the cool colors I'll usually pull more into the shadow areas of the eye. Or not just of the eye, just in skin in general. And then the warm colors I like to build up where the skin is typically more thinner. So areas like the nose or your fingers or your elbows, your knees, sometimes your toes. And then the area around the eye, typically I like to make them just a tad more warm in their color. Someone's asking, other than applying directly to big companies like Ubisoft, what are some other venues to send work portfolios to actively look for work? So this is a good question, and one that I'm going to be covering in the portfolio course as well. And that is, you don't have to be working for a big company. Like, that shouldn't just be like your main dream. Is like, I'm going to work for EA, and I'm going to be working on the next Last of Us for Naughty Dog. I mean, they're very ambitious dreams, and I'm not saying don't do that, but start small. Think about all the little indie companies, or sometimes you might not even be doing video games that are like console-based or computer-based. Most of my friends work slot games, like they work in slot games, and obviously that was not the expected route when we first went to school, but when you're first starting out, sometimes you just need to get your foot in the industry door, and then if you're a hard worker and you're very passionate about what you do, over time you will definitely be able to work at the bigger names, because then as your skills develop, you'll be definitely catching the attention of these bigger name artists if you're applying to them. Because I think the best thing I found when I've been doing my research for like what makes a solid portfolio or what you should be looking for a job after is top talent is always needed. So like if you are one of those big artists that are really, really skilled, there will always be a job lined up for you somewhere. Someone's asking, to make faces, where do you start? Learn the muscles, the skull, both? I already made many faces, but I always get to the point where you see it's a human face, but still doesn't look it right. Do you think it makes sense to make the skull first? This is one of those tough questions where, depending on who you ask, they'll give you a different answer. Because even I know in the CG Cookie House, we've had different discussions about this, where like Jonathan Williamson, the main guy of Blender, will say it's very important to learn all the anatomy structures, and like I think he would say it would be more beneficial to start with the skull and then learn about the muscle anatomy on top of that, and then work on the skin. But then if you talk to like myself or Kent, we'll say more look at references and try to depict them as accurately as possible, and over time the proportions will just kind of click with you. And it's for me, I learned to draw by the backwards way, so the way that Kent and I have learned, where it's you don't learn the anatomy and the bone structure, you just learn from life. You learn from drawing people. Life drawing was a really big thing for me, and I think that over time I got more curious about like the anatomy and the understructure of the skin and the anatomy. And then once I learned that, I felt like then what I had already established became that much more accurate, and it displayed a bit more of that realistic nature that I've always kind of clung to. So I do believe it's important both ways, and I think whatever is more comfortable for you, like if you're finding that you're going straight to doing like the face and it's not working for you, then yeah, say maybe either take two routes. One, look at reference pictures and try to depict it and recreate it as accurately as possible just from that picture. And two, learn the under anatomy, and that's the bone structures and the muscle anatomy, and learn that way. Neither way is right or wrong or better than the other. It just kind of what works best for you. Okay, so right now my eye's looking pretty naked. I'm going to go ahead and add a few more touches of color here and there. And you can see like right now, without the actual eyelashes, the eye itself looks very inaccurate, and for me it actually looks really wrong. And that bothers the heck out of me, so I want to try to fix it sooner than later. But I'm also trying to make sure I'm looking at all the questions you guys are asking and answering them. Someone's asking, Tim, I don't have a portfolio yet, but I was offered a let's see what you can do job. Could something like that end up biting me in the ass if I'm not quite ready? Yes. This is definitely one of those things where I feel like every artist goes through one of these phases where I don't want to say this, but I think I'm going to say it because of how much I believe it, how much they get screwed by a single job. while I was in school, I had a job that didn't pay me, and it was more of an experience-based thing. But like when you're in school, you're just excited. You're like, yeah, I'm working for this company, and they're making a little indie game. Awesome. I learned a lot from it. I learned how to animate in Photoshop because I was forced to, because it is a job type scenario, and it is very true that you learn so much more on the job than you do in school. And I think every artist can go through that, but they shouldn't go through it more than once. So if you've been screwed before, do not do it again. Please, please, please do not do it again where you'll work for free. And even if they say they have all the potential in the world to get big, and you'll even hear success stories of where, yeah, people took chances and it actually did pay off. But I'm telling you, that is like a sliver of an amount of people that I've heard from that have done a work for free type job gig and it did not pay off and they wasted a lot of time and energy, and for the most part they felt like they were ripped off and it actually discouraged them from doing art in the future. So please, if you do that, feel very cautious about the way you go forward with that. And I'm only saying that because I want to protect you guys as well. I know I was in the scenario where I kind of got not screwed over because I feel like I did learn a lot and it was only for about 3 months, but it was still enough where I felt like cheated, I felt played, I felt taken advantage of, and I don't want you guys to have to feel that way and get discouraged from doing art. So while I've been babbling, I continue to draw, and what I'm trying to do now is just give it some more look to it while covering up the line art. So I could probably even just cover the line art in its entirety and work from there. But I kind of like building around it and working with it. Because sometimes I usually like some of the line art marks that I create, so I try to work with that rather than against it. And all of this I've been doing with a circle hard edge brush. So I've been trying to showcase that, even things like this, where you might feel, oh, you need a skin brush or you need a texture brush, you can still create it with just a plain old circle brush. Someone's asking, is it a bad idea to use Gaussian blur filter to plan transitions between colors? Um, I never think that there's bad ideas. I feel like there's bad executions. Because I know even with some people, they like to use the blur tool a lot, not the actual filter blur, but like the smudge tool. And there's some cases where I have seen it done pretty successful, where I've been actually really impressed. But in the same note, I think there's a way to misuse tools that you're given. So like a good example would be the dodge and burn tool, where I feel like a lot of artists just starting out, it's like a very easy way to shade and give things value. But in the long run, it actually will hurt them if they kind of attach themselves to using that method over and over again. But actually, as I say that, I'm thinking, well, I mean, if there are artists out there that make it work and they're like, they've really mastered the art and tool that they've been given, then why not use it? So I always say, like, I mean, if it works for you, then keep using it, unless if you feel that you're using it as a crutch because you can't do it without the tool. Because then that's actually harmful, in my opinion. Alright, now for these eyes, and what I usually do is I don't actually draw the eyelashes. And that's because characters that I draw from far away, they're not, the people that are viewing these characters aren't me looking, like zooming in times 10 and looking at the eyelashes that they're adding. Now, if this was a study where I'm really trying to portray an accurate eyeball, then yes, I wouldn't even add this dark line that I added here because this is kind of giving the illusion of eyelashes. But if I wanted to go ahead and add eyelashes, I guess I could. So when I change my brush, I have shape dynamics turned on so I can get that nice range of the sizing here. Okay, so I do a quick pass on the questions in the live stream. And this is why I usually like to have Deandra with me to look through the questions, because the one thing I really don't like about Google Hangouts is the comments don't come in as the time goes by. They work with whichever comments have the most likes on them will be the ones near the top I don't really like. Okay, so now for the eyeball itself, when I'm doing eyelashes, think of the eye from the side. So let's see here. So if you can imagine, this is the eyeball, this is the iris, pupil. This is the way they're looking. So the way that I draw eyelashes is you have them coming out of the two folds of the skin, and they kind of have a curve to it as they pull out. And that's the way that I always think of eyelashes, where a lot of people will draw it like straight up like this, where unless they have a lot of mascara on or they're wearing fake eyelashes, almost never do that in real life. Or they'll be more eye level with the eye, because the curve starts right above the eye and it goes down first and then back up. Do have longer eyelashes will have a longer curve to them, but for the more realistic. And then the area like on this side of the eye will have a curve like this compared to the eyelashes on this side, which will curve like this. And that's because the eyeball is round, and then the eyelashes are starting at a different area of where the roundness of the eye is, if that makes sense. And then they usually, not even usually, they almost always get smaller as you get closer to either side of the eye. And then longer, usually like the longest lashes will be toward the center. And don't feel afraid to intermix them, because if you do them all straight without any eyelashes touching, that'll actually make it look really unrealistic, where that's definitely something you're trying to avoid here. Now for the lower lashes, I try not to make them quite as blunt as the upper lashes, where I try to have them be more subtle. And if you usually struggle with eyelashes, try not to make them look as blunt first. Make them more subtle and then build them up from there. And I think that's the best way you can learn how to do eyelashes, where even though how hard I'm pressing on the tablet is very soft, because I don't want to give them too much thickness to the eyelashes compared to the top eyelashes. Okay, now I'm looking through the comments really quick again. Okay, we're good. And like I said, feel free to ask anything if you have any questions, and it could even be unrelated to what I'm doing here. And really quick, I'm just going to outline the exposed tissue a little more. Because even the questions about you guys asking about like portfolio or getting a job, literally anything that you guys have questions on, that's why I do the live streams, is because I want to help you guys. Typically it's to give you tips about the subject matter that I'm working on, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to only give you tips on what I'm working on. I want to give you tips on anything you're curious about or just kind of want to know, or maybe you're struggling with. Like maybe you're going through a phase where it's like, is concept art right for me? And you really want to make sure that you're going down a route that is the best for you. So even things like art school, I get asked that a lot, like, was it worth it to go to art school? And I think that's an important question to know, or to ask if you're one of those people that aren't sure. Someone's asking, will I draw veins in the eyes? It's one of those things where typically I try to avoid hyper details like that, because for most characters that I do, I'm not working super close to that detail. But since I guess we're kind of focusing on this eyeball and making it like a macro focus, I think I will add some veins to the eye, to the cornea, I should say. Now, usually the area around this corner of the eye where the exposed muscle tissue is, try to highlight that a little bit, and that'll give you a nice depth contrast. Okay, so now at this point, you're probably thinking, all right, the eye looks all right, but what can we do to take it that next step further? And this is where we will go ahead and add some highlights. So I'm going to go ahead and grab an almost pure white, and it'll be slightly warm right there. Let's go ahead and add some white to the actual eye itself. Now, oftentimes, this is a quick fix if you're having like a bright light that is being kind of shown on the eye. But oftentimes, if you're in a natural environment and if the eye isn't catching any of the direct sunlight, you'll have a different highlight. But that I can do in a different video because I think that's a little more complicated to explain. So let's go ahead and add some highlights here. So the first one that I usually like to do is one that is directly on the pupil, sometimes overlapping on the iris. And that one gives you an immediate sense of where the light is coming from, and that's why I usually like to add it right away when I get to this stage. And then to make sure that we also can tell that this white part of the eye has some glossiness to it, because the white part of the eye obviously isn't like a matte look or a matte finish. We want to make it have some of that reflective nature as well. Usually just speckling a little white here and there will give it that look. You don't want to overdo it because then it might start to look plastic, but you do want to do it enough where it's definitely giving the sense that this is not an absorbing type texture or material. It definitely has that reflective nature to it. And oftentimes you'll see on like the inside fold of the eye of the lower lid will have some white speckling as well. Then I also like to add just little tidbits here and there, so like areas below the lower lid, around the exposed muscle here. I like to dot it on usually. I don't like it to be just a static brush stroke. Because often the little emphasis of the pores like this, what we're doing right now, that's what will give it that hyper-realistic feel, if that's what you're going for. Now, obviously, this doesn't look hyper-realistic. This is more of a trying to be realism. Now, if I was really trying to do like hyper-realism, I'd be zooming in and I would be using photo references up the wazoo, because I want to make sure that this thing is looking as accurate to an actual eyeball as humanly possible. And now I'll usually add a bounce light. Actually, I'm going to do this on a new layer. Because oftentimes, let's say the ground plane that they're standing on, let's say they're standing on like a cement ground plane. The light that hits that cement will be bouncing and coming back and catching the eye on the lower part of the iris, on that little contact that kind of surrounds the iris. So I'll make sure that I'm catching it on the lower part. And that's what will give you that look. Now, it's not to say that I can't also do it on the top part as well. And oftentimes the most realistic eyes will have like a reflection of a window or something where there's light that's being reflected on the actual eyeball itself. But it's almost like mirroring the environment around them, if you want to think of it like that. So let's see here. I guess the one thing I could also do, and actually so this is what it looks like before and after the highlights. And you can see there's definitely a difference of that sense of realism and value to it before and after. But the one thing I wanted to do was add more detail to the eye. So why don't I go ahead and zoom in, because I feel like the stream is kind of focusing on the almond eye. Originally, I wanted it to be on like creating all and doing like a quick pass on all of them. But I actually think this might be more beneficial if I focus on one to kind of give you guys the tips and techniques if you wanted to go out and create the other ones. Okay, so the eyeball itself, if you look really close at your iris, or even at a Google reference image, you'll see that it has all these little lines. And oh man, I wish I could remember the term for what this is called, but I can't at the moment. But I guess for now I'll just call it like a flower pedaling technique. We are kind of working from the inside of the pupil and out to create these almost seemingly random scribbles that come out of the iris. And oftentimes there's like a line that separates the iris from the pupil lines, and that'll be seen kind of in the middle of the center of the iris itself. So then from here, I'll usually take that blue that we use for the pupil, grab a lighter color of that blue, and then just kind of shade in the different areas. And there's another thing where it almost looks random. And sometimes that random nature actually will give it that realistic sense. Someone's asking, Krita allows not to draw with in high dynamic range. Do you think it's useful? Will you paint in high dynamic range? To be honest, I'm not even sure what that term means, because I've never been able to use Krita since I have a Mac, and that's the only platform and hardware I've ever been able to use. So I've been dying for them to make a Mac OS build, but I'm still kind of in the dark in terms of hearing when that will be released, because I hear rumors that they're working on one right now, but I don't believe it's going to be released anytime in the near future. Because I would say as of now, the only softwares I've really used and feel somewhat comfortable understanding completely would be Mischief and Photoshop. Because then I obviously have dabbled in like GIMP and what is Corel Painter or Corel Painter. And then for the most part, those are the two ones. Maybe a little dabbling in Sketchbook Pro, and then Alchemy, which was a fun one for getting good starts. But for the most part, I would say I kind of focus on Photoshop. So now I'm going to do it one more time with an even more intense blue. So this is the blue that I'm using right now. And I'm almost just like highlighting different areas of this iris that we just created. Now, like I said before, I rarely actually do this on my characters, where I go this super close to the eyeball and affect it, because the distance that a viewer would be looking at this piece, they wouldn't even see any of the details that I'm adding here. Unless if we're actually creating a super close-up version of the character where the purpose is to see the different details that you're adding here. But when you're this zoomed in, then you really want to make sure like then all the other areas look just as good. Like the white part of the eye looks very flat to me in this image. So I would probably go ahead and edit that a little bit. So in the area where like this lower lid hits the cornea of the eye, it's a little sloppy where I'm going to clean it up here. Okay, so now's a good point where I'm going to have a cast shadow on the eye. And I should have been flipping this canvas more than I have been this stream. And I'm already over my hour mark, but I'm going to go ahead and at least finish off this eye. So usually what I'll like to do is I'll lay a pretty heavy overcast cast shadow and then use my eraser tool and erase from there. And you can see the look that that gives. So let me hide that layer on and off. So then you can definitely see the amount of realism that that adds. It adds a nice touch of lighting in the direction of the lighting. But the thing that doesn't make sense is the highlight lands in the cast shadow. So I actually have to lift the cast shadow that I added so that it makes sense with the highlights that I added before. That's something that you always want to be just at least aware of, is where you're putting your lighting, and make sure that it's coherent all the way throughout your piece. Then from here, this is probably where I would start to add more of a texture. So I'm going to grab my skin, and this is one that you can download from the site, but I'm going to go ahead and lay it on. Because up until this point, I haven't used any texture, but skin itself is a very much texture apparent surface. Especially when you're this close up on something like skin, you want to make sure that you're adding at least touches of that realism to it. Oh, you know what? All these highlight layers are on a layer above it. And was like, why can't I draw over this here? Now before I cut the stream out, I'm going to just touch on a few other little details that I think are kind of fun to add if you want to add more of that detail and realism to it. So your eye blinks all the time, and the two folds that we have here constantly are folding, and I think when the eye is open, if you want to add another touch of realism, kind of showcase those wrinkles with just a few horizontal highlight lines. And I'll maybe touch on the top, just barely though. I'm actually really not liking how thick this area is that meets the eye. And I would do a lot of cleanup work here. So this is the only problem I would say if I am switching from something that's more far away than making it like a macro focus, is then I really have to clean up the edges and make it look better, because now we're seeing it so close up. So something like this would drive me crazy, because then I would have to do a lot of fixing, and I would almost even just start over. But I also believe that you can fix it if you take the time, where you don't have to just completely restart, unless if you feel it would be more efficient for you to just restart the entire piece. Okay, now I don't know if that's the line art layer. So at this point, I probably would turn off the line art layer, because it's not really adding anything, and if anything, it's just kind of in the way. So now the last thing that I'm going to do, and I know I keep saying the last thing, but in my mind, I'm just like, oh yeah, I forgot to do that. Oh, I forgot to do that. Oh, and someone just told me they are making a Mac version soon. They're crowdfunding it right now. That'd be awesome. I would love to play in Krita. I feel like this is a software that could be comparable to Photoshop, especially with the open source factoring, or maybe it's just because of its. I forgot why I liked this one more than GIMP, but I feel like it's more comparable to Photoshop. So I'm actually really excited to have that go through. Really quick, I'm also going to look through the questions. Someone said, I'm thinking of going into concept art. Any tips of where to start? Drawing. Draw every day. And if you're looking for a place to start, be your best. You are your best source of reference and knowledge. And I think that if you know where to get that knowledge from, if you're using YouTube, if you're using Google search, I know I use that a lot for like, what does the overlay layer blend mode do? And don't rely on other things to get you your opportunities. Be your own opportunity grabber. So like right here, I'm using my overlay layer, and that's why I was talking about it just a second ago, to really highlight different areas and punch up the colors. And if you know me, you know that I like to lay it on pretty thick first and then turn down the layer's opacity. Let's pull a warm yellowish color. And it'll look way crazy saturated until I turn down the layer opacity. Alright, so you can see how crazy colored that overlay layer made it. So now let's take it and turn that layer's opacity down quite a bit. So it's at 35%. And you can see the subtle difference that it'll give it, but it's just enough where I'm starting to really like the additions that's given it. And from here, I would probably work in like adding the blues and my shadows and get more into the things that you don't necessarily have to add, but you can just to give it that little touch of the personal art look to it that you're going for, like a personal style, if you want to call it that. But for the most part, I think I'm going to call this eye finished. And for those of you who have been wondering, I have my little notepad of my portfolio course written out. I also have a full course on how to make buttons that I need to get ahead and started on. But the other things are, we got a really awesome tutorial coming out tomorrow from Piper. I'm going to just completely ruin how to pronounce her name. I think it's Thibodeau, and she is a fantastic digital artist. And her tutorial was really fun to watch. It had some humor in it, which was unexpected. So if you're a Citizen member, definitely be excited for tomorrow's tutorial release. And besides that, I think I'm done. Oh, and if you guys have seen the new How to Train Your Dragon 2 movie, I just saw it and I don't know what I thought about it. I'm kind of curious to hear what you guys think. It was the first time I felt very old coming out of the theater, where I felt I was definitely not like the intended market or age group. And I don't know if I was just not having it on that day because I loved the first one. I don't know what was going on in my head, but I didn't like it as much. And maybe it didn't help that I just saw the Lego movie again over the weekend. And I think that movie is incredible. I thought just anything from the animation to how clever and witty it was, I thought everything was just like spot on. Alright, yeah, this eye is going to be called Done. So I want to thank you guys for coming to this live stream. I hope you were able to pick up some tips on how to draw the eye. And even though we only got to actually like completely finish one, and I didn't think I was going to get that into detail on just a singular eyeball, I hope that you guys can kind of see like the process of how you want to build up your values, and then work in your different colors, be very conscious of the lighting that you're adding everywhere. And then from there, hopefully you'll be able to add eyes on your own characters. And then be very conscious of what type of eye you're adding too. So if it's hooded or round or almond, droopy, slanted, or even a combination of them. Now really quick, I'm going to be looking through the comments, see if there's any that I missed. Someone asked, where do you think is the best way to start doing concept art piece? Either characters, environments, weapons, vehicles, or map painting. And I don't know, that's a really vague answer. I would say start with the basics. Start small and then build upon them. Because if you don't have the foundations, you're not going to really have an awesome building on top of that. So work on your foundations first, and then kind of see based on your personality what do you enjoy doing more. Like I'm really bad at environments, and I think if I spent the time to work on them, I could get better. But it does not come as natural to me as doing characters do. So definitely, it's a personal thing as well. Someone's saying, how do you draw the reflection in the eye? I know it's too much detail, but it helps with the realism. Um, Depending on where the eye is, and usually the really awesome eyes that you'll see drawn on DeviantArt will have like a window reflecting in them or some kind of lighting scenario where you can easily depict, oh, this is the type of lights they have in this room that they took this picture of the eye in. So I would look at like pictures of real eyeballs and really look at the reflection and how they kind of act as mirrors to the environment around them, and kind of pick up and take apart what you see from your reference and then try to pull it and use it in your own work. Oh, someone asked if I can draw the veins in the eyes. I guess I forgot to do that. So usually the veins in the eyes will kind of sprout out here. And I like to work at a lower opacity so that the veins are not like overwhelming. Now, if you're like me, who wore contacts for so long, you feel like you'll have these like little veins that will never go away. And even after I got LASIK, I still feel like the veins in my eyes are still pretty apparent. So like that. I like to keep them usually really subtle. I don't like to make them overbearing where it's like, that person needs eye drops. Okay, I think I got all the questions you guys have. Let me do one more look through. And as always, if you have any other questions, I mean, feel free to ask me at any time. And oh, someone's saying Psycho made a really good fundamental video for different types of art. So if that is something that interests you, definitely look at that tutorial. He has some great ones up there. I've watched quite a few of his. Okay, that's it. Okay, thank you guys for coming to this live stream. We do these every Wednesday at 2 p.m. and that's Central Time in the States, and outside of it, it is -5 GMT, I believe. And I usually post what we will be doing an hour beforehand. Or if you have a suggestion, I would love to hear it. Like even today, I didn't even know what I was going to draw until like an hour before this live stream. So if you have a suggestion where you really want to see something drawn, put it on the Facebook page once I put the results on the Facebook page. Put your ideas on there, and then maybe you'll see it next week come to fruition. So thank you guys again for coming, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Okay, bye guys.